Hi everybody, it's Chris Kandaya here and welcome to another edition of FAQ, Faith and Quarantine. Wherever you are in the world, you are very welcome, but we'd love to know where you are, so drop us a comment, let us know you're here, tell us where you're watching from. We know some people are watching this in groups as part of their kind of home group. I think they're all kind of watching it at the same time and then having a little discussion afterwards. That could be a fun way of interacting. Stick with us for the next 20 minutes or so. We're going to be exploring the question of how do you find faith when you are in lockdown. And tonight I was out for my one expedition outside the house with my wife. Went for a little walk around our town. As I looked up, the night sky was absolutely beautiful. The moon was beaming bright, but I saw also, I think it was the International Space Station. If you're out at night, look up. It's the little bright shining dot that was above the moon. And can you imagine what it would be like to be on that space station? Looking down on the earth and wondering how your friends and family are doing. I feel pretty far away from my dad, who's about 100 miles away from me, and we can't be with him because of social isolation. But imagine what those guys on the space station are feeling right now. It also kind of launched loads of tropes in my mind from loads of the sci-fi movies I grew up with, whether it's Planet of the Apes, you know, where the spaceman goes up, they circulate the earth, and when they come down again, everything is different. What a kind of strange experience. So how are you experiencing lockdown? I'd love to know what you're feeling. Again, drop me a little message. Tell me what's going through your mind. Are you frustrated because you can't get on with your work in the way that you want to? Are you feeling boxed in, a bit of cabin fever? Is it a bit of a pressure cooker with the relationships in your household? Or are you feeling lonely? What's going on with you? Help us to know so we can make these videos as useful as we can to you. Big shout out to anyone that's watching in Hadnam. We know that hadnam.net has shared this, and on Sunday Hadnam Baptist Church is going to be doing a Facebook live service, so you might want to tune into that at 10:15 GMT. I'm going to be speaking from the book of Romans. But tonight we're looking at the I think a pretty much unknown story to many people, hidden in the Bible, and it's a really rich story. I thought we could call it Sex, Spies and Scarlet Cord, but you'll maybe see where we're coming from. Last night, and this is a series we're doing every evening, we looked at the story of Joshua, a man who was called to lead at a really difficult moment in history. Everything was changing for him. It was like the world was being turned upside down, and many of us can relate to that. Well, the very next chapter, chapter 2 of the book of Joshua, tells another story about some spies, what seems to be a sex worker, and a scarlet cord. And I'm going to read some of it to you if you want to follow along. It's in Joshua chapter 2. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Now, they've dropped in the word Jericho. If you're familiar with anything in the Old Testament, maybe you know the story of Joshua and Jericho. It's a big issue. It involves what seems to be a kind of mild form of genocide where everyone in that particular city gets wiped out. And so anyone reading this story afterwards will know Jericho is a kind of watchword for devastation. And if you have a question about why God would allow genocide, please let me know. I'm happy to answer it if you're interested. Otherwise, huge book plug. Here's the book I wrote about paradox, and the book of Joshua and genocide is in that one. All right, verse 2. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab. Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came here, but I do not know where they had come. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I didn't know which way they went. Go after them quickly, you may catch up with them. But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Interesting bunch of ethical and moral dilemmas, aren't they? Rahab, we're going to find out later, is a bit of a heroine when it comes to what faith looks like. She's a Canaanite, and they are an enemy people as far as the Israelites are concerned. God is going to send his people into the promised land, the land that's been promised for generations to the Israelite people, but there are already people there. And God uses the Israelites as a means of judgment on the people that were in the land. So this is a big deal. Again, got a question, happy to answer it. But Rahab, who appears to be a prostitute, some translations say she was an innkeeper. New Testament calls her a prostitute. Anyway, who knows why or what her circumstances are. It's not made a big deal of here. But the ethical dilemma is, should she have lied to the Canaanite forces, to the Canaanite king? Was it for the greater good, the lesser of two evils, that she lied and therefore protected these men from being killed? Again, the Bible doesn't really make a big deal out of that. It's just kind of by the by. Why should she know the kind of moral standards of the rest of the Bible? But it does remind me, doesn't it remind you of the story of Corrie ten Boom? She was a Dutch lady, and her and her sister hid Jewish people during the Second World War to stop them being executed, but she refused to lie, and God kind of protected her and the Jewish people that were in the house. Sadly, they were eventually imprisoned, but the Jewish people managed to get to safety. Christians through the centuries have tried to hold a kind of moral integrity, and we're not supposed to kind of borrow Rahab's virtue here. We're not supposed to say that she is a moral example. It just seems to be glossed over. Anyway, we'll move on. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, and when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og and the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts sank, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I've shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Wow. What an amazing story. Some say, when it comes to the Old Testament, this is the longest uninterrupted bit of speech from a woman. Massive issue around patriarchy in the Old Testament. Very happy to answer that question if you got it. You just let me know. But here she is, and she's talking about what people who haven't had access to face-to-face encounter with God still know about him. What has been kind of passed around and gossiped around, even the Canaanite nation. They'd heard of the history of Israel and how their God was the God over all the nations. He wasn't a localized deity. He wasn't just a Jewish God. He's the God that rules over everything. This is hugely controversial. Some people say, well, you know, it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you're sincere. Whatever God kind of works for you, you go for it. But Rahab understands something else here. Whatever gods her family and her ancestors worshipped, they were not the God over heaven and earth, because they hadn't done the deeds that the God of Israel had done, and therefore he was the true God. And so she's asking for mercy. She's asking to be put right with this God, to be rescued from the coming judgment of this God. And she asks the people of God to give her help. Now, I'll tell you, this story, as I've looked at it today, I've been thinking about, again, the power of hospitality. That's a theme I'm very passionate about. I run a fostering and adoption charity, and I try to help people think about radical hospitality. I wrote a book about hospitality, and I was thinking about all the different stories in the Bible which kind of articulate the power of hospitality, and I forgot to include Rahab. I really should have done, shouldn't I? Because Rahab offers incredibly generous, radical hospitality to God's people, these two spies. Her life was in danger. She was siding with the enemy, and yet she still welcomed them in. And she welcomed them in because she recognized who their God was. And what's fascinating, when the New Testament picks up the theme of trust in God, and she does it by welcoming God's people. What she's doing to God's people, she's asking for from God. She's asking for hospitality from him. It's a very, very interesting idea. Because when the story of Rahab is picked up in the New Testament, it is a couple of times. once in the book of James, and once in the book of Hebrews, and the other one, Matthew, I'll get back to in a minute. But in Hebrews 11, you've got this kind of hall of fame. You've got all these incredibly famous, predominantly men of faith. And Rahab is mentioned in this. I mean, you've had some big players. You've had Abraham, you've had Moses, and then you get Rahab. And it says this in verse 31. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Rahab's hospitality to God's people is marked to be a sign of her faith in God. What you do for the least of these, you do for me. And in James, her story is put alongside that of Abraham, where people have been saying, well, how do you know whether you've really got faith? It's not enough just to say you believe, because in one sense, even the devil believes in God. Doesn't make him on God's side, doesn't make him a Christian. And what James says is, actually, your faith is demonstrated through your deeds. It's what you do in response to God that shows whether you believe in him or not. It's a bit like someone that says, yeah, I believe in the coronavirus, but I'm just going to live my life as I did before. I'm going to go out shopping, I'm going to shake hands with people, I'm going to kiss people, I'm going to cough on people. I believe in the coronavirus. Actually, your actions will demonstrate whether you really believe in the coronavirus or not, because your behaviour will change. And in the New Testament, that is understood, that you demonstrate your faith in God by what you do. Now, hear this though. It isn't your actions that allow you to be acceptable to God. It's not that by being a nice person and being hospitable, that kind of earns brownie points with God and then God will welcome you. It's actually the other way around. Christians believe it's through what Jesus did on the cross, and we'll come to that in a minute. It's through what Jesus did on the cross that we're made acceptable to God. But having received mercy from God and grace from God and compassion from God and hospitality from God, we now want to pass that on. And that seems to be what's going on in the story of Rahab. She really believes that God is the God of heaven and earth, and she needs to be right with him, and so she acts. She offers hospitality to God's people, and that action is a sign of her faith. Her faith is demonstrated through her deeds. That's a really important distinction. Again, if you want to ask me a question about that, I'd love to answer it. Anyway, the spies actually do a deal with her. And they say in verse 14, our lives for your lives. The men assured her, if you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. Now she had said to them, go to the hills so that the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. The men said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless, when we enter the land, you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. Unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. If anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on him. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us to swear. Agreed, she replied. Let it be as you say. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. What a story! Amazing, isn't it? So Rahab is going to show her trust in God by putting a scarlet cord in the window after she's let the spies go. And that scarlet cord is going to mark her house out as different. I don't know about you, but I'm thinking when the people of Israel were escaping from their captivity in Egypt, one of the things they needed to do when all the plagues hit, the last of the plagues was that the angel of death was going to go over the land of Egypt and would steal and kill the firstborn of every household. But those households that put their trust in God would kill a lamb and paint its blood on the door or the lintel of the door of the house. And then the angel of the Lord will pass over it. The red blood marked your house as being different. I don't know whether it's significant, but it's just making something buzz in my head that it's a scarlet cord, a scarlet rope around the window is going to mark out this house as being different. This is how the judgment of God on Jericho is going to be avoided if Rahab puts the scarlet rope in the window, that's how she knows that she's still trusting God. And for me, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because the people of Israel do invade the land. We're not quite sure how long after, but quite a while after. While they do that, they begin to march around the city of Jericho. Do you remember they marched around it 7 times in a day? And at the last time, they were playing all their instruments. They do a massive sound, and the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Maybe you know that from Sunday school. So think about what it was like. You are Rahab, and all your family are cooped up in your house, looking out the window. Sound a little bit familiar to your experience of COVID? Looking out the window, but trying to hold on to trusting God, thinking, hold on, there's this massive, army marching around our big city wall, and that God is with them. He's the God that has killed off the Egyptians, even though they're the biggest military superpower. Now there's just this tiny city, a city so small you can march around it 7 times, and we've been told that we should make peace with God, but our leaders are not listening. So she just has to hold on to the promise, even though things seem to get pretty bad, even though it looked like death and destruction was coming. And for me, that's quite a good little idea for us, isn't it? We don't know what's going on in the world. We're doing our best to show hospitality and kindness to those around us, but we're ultimately not in control of what's happening with this coronavirus. And things might get worse. Will we, like Rahab, hold on to the promise that God has given us, that he will ultimately look after us, whether that's in life or in death? He is trustworthy, and we can hold on to him. And for Christians, this story of Rahab is written before Jesus, but it's signaling some of the ideas that Jesus picks up, that the judgment of God is coming, and there is a way that we can escape from it by trusting God's promise that we can be included into the family of God, and therefore we do not need to be afraid. And that is exactly what happened to Rahab. When the New Testament picks up on Rahab for the 3rd time, it does so in the genealogy or the life history, the family tree of Jesus. Because Rahab becomes part of the family of God. In fact, if you know the story, we looked at it on Mother's Day actually, the story of Naomi and Ruth, and how Ruth marries Boaz. And Boaz is the grandfather of David, the greatest king in the Old Testament. Well, guess what? Boaz's mother was Rahab. It's incredible. She isn't just included in the family of God, like, distant relative of important people. She's part of the family tree of King David, who's part of the family tree of Jesus. In fact, there are 3 women mentioned in the family tree of Jesus. One is Ruth, one is Rahab, and I can't remember who the 3rd one is, but anyway, another woman is included in the family tree of Jesus. And both Ruth and Rahab are not Israelites. They're included no matter what their history, whatever their background, whatever their ethnicity, they're included. The offer of God's love is available to all. So I guess what are the takeaways for you tonight? I would say, look, wherever you are from, whatever your background, whatever you've done, whatever your work history, if it's something similar to Rahab or worse, Rahab probably didn't have a lot of options in her life. There is a God who is willing and wanting to welcome you into his family. He wants you to avoid the punishment and judgment that he will one day bring on the earth. He wants you to know the safety and security of being part of his family. And that's made possible to us as we cling not to a scarlet cord, but on to the person of Jesus and what he did for us on the cross. And that can give us great courage, even if present circumstances seem to make things worse and worse. We still have a promise to cling to that circumstances can't rob us from. So that's one thing. I think the other thing to say is that it's not enough to say that you believe in God. Our belief in God needs to be worked out in actions. And one of the most important ways the New Testament and the Old Testament together say that we can demonstrate our love for God is how we love other people. Rahab welcomes some spies whose lives were in danger, and that's part of her act of faith to trust in God by showing compassion. Who is it that you can show compassion to? Who are the neighbours around you that might need, in a self-isolating and totally COVID-friendly way, might need some hospitality or some help. Maybe it's getting shopping, maybe it's a phone call. Who are the people that you can demonstrate grace and compassion to in this moment? Wherever you are on the earth, or even if you're orbiting in the International Space Station, I pray that you have a fantastic weekend. We'll be picking up these FAQs again on Monday at 8 o'clock. If you want to join me for some more Bible teaching or inspiration, you can join me on the Haddenham Baptist Church Sunday service at 10:15. I will also share it on my feed so you can join in there too. If you've got any questions or you've got anything you'd like to tell me about or something I might have got wrong, really happy to hear that. Just drop me a line. It's been lovely spending time with you. God bless you.